As we say in Dutch, goed zo, good. It is now 11:30. People are still coming in, I assume, but I think we've got quorum. It's always important to have quorum. Welcome to this workshop on cybersecurity. We have two panels today within the workshop, this morning and this afternoon. This morning we're going to talk about current practices in cybersecurity. Try to get an inventory of practices which people think are at least current and perhaps even best current practices, or maybe even the worst current practices. The format that we have is hopefully highly interactive. I want to start with you all, peoples. I want you to ask the question to the panel and not have the panel make the statements so that you can respond to them. But before going into the details, I would like to introduce the panel. In our midst, we have Ian Brown. He's Professor of Information Security and Privacy at the Oxford Institute. And Ian, Ian, okay. This is I'm non-native, so what was the last thing you tweeted?
It was I think it was telling everyone to participate remotely in this panel. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
So we have Alexandru Frunza, who is the Program Officer for Cybercrime Division of the Council of Europe. What was the last spam message you opened? What was that about?
I can't remember. This is a trick question.
Okay. And then we have Nigel Hicks, who is ICANN's Vice President on International Organization Engagement. I'm going to ask a leading question. Nigel, what was the best news you heard in the last 24 hours?
Well, I suppose it must have been about football, but perhaps, could it have been about Brexit? No, the IANA transition.
Of course.
Of course. We're programmed to respond like that.
Now I have to come up with a smart question for Ilya Kaspar, who is the responsible for the international policy at Global Partner Digital. Let's see, cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity and women, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one. So how often do you find yourself to be the only woman on a panel?
You mean the token woman on the panel?
Which in this case, I assure you, you are not.
Yeah, and I have to say I was contacted fairly early, so I do suspect that this was a genuinely proactive outreach.
But how often does it happen?
It happens
a lot. This industry is still dominated by menels, as I call them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Those are the panelists, and I'm sure they will have interesting perspectives. By the way, my name is Olaf Kolkman. I'm the Chief Internet Technology Officer of the Internet Society. I have a technical background. Among us, we have Tatjana Tropina from the Max Planck Institute. She will be our co-moderator. We are moderating this session together. She will be walking around, handing you the microphone if you have something to say. Then we have Fortune Costa. He's over there. He is the remote moderator. Fortune, how many people, can you see how many people have joined us online? Three people are online.
That's how your advertisement works, Ian Brown.
All 3,700 of my followers are going to turn up in the next 10 minutes.
So much for the internet bringing us together. We really need to meet face to face for these type of things. Bastiaan Goslings is our rapporteur. At the end of the meeting, we will give him 5 minutes so that he can read out how he captured this panel in about 3 to 4 bullet points. That will be the report out of this session. I don't want to forget Roy Graafs, who is in the behind, and he is the person who does all the captioning here. That I always find a very nice thing to have as a non-native speaker. I think it helps our diversity. And besides, when I lose concentration, I can always see what the participants brought us. Okay, so we're going to talk about current practices in cybersecurity. It's a very broad field. I have an agenda for this meeting, and it's a very personal agenda. The Internet Society, and shameless plug, has created this framework for Internet security, not cybersecurity, Internet security. We call it collaborative security. My agenda for today is listen very carefully to what people bring here and see if it fits into this framework or not, whether that framework applies, and what we can learn from this. So, I am here to listen and learn, and apply what I learn in my day job. I'm sort of interested if you in your audience have takeaways that you hear that you will take back to your day job. You know, if during the session you hear something that is very interesting that you will use in your day job, I would like to learn that too. Because I think that is the success of what we do here. So that is all by means of introductions as far as I'm concerned. Tatjana, do you have something to add?
No, I don't think we have to introduce anyone. Just to warn that we will move soon to you, to the audience. I will have 2 microphones. I will be that annoying person running around with 2 microphones, and I will lend you one of them for you to state what is your cybersecurity concern, or maybe what kind of question would you like to ask any of the panelists, not necessarily particular panelists, just a general question. Or what do you think is your best practice in cybersecurity? Or what would you like to change? So imagine that we are at the cybersecurity jazz jam session, and you have your say, and you have a microphone. So anyone wants to go.
Is there somebody who wants
Because
to?
if no one wants to go, then I will start picking up people whom I know and make them intervene. So you better to volunteer.
Just by means of timeline, we have 20 minutes set aside for your input now. And it would be very embarrassing if we don't get your input, because after that, the panelists have 30 minutes to respond to that. And after that, we go into 10 minutes of shared time together again. And then we end up with a wrap-up. So that's sort of the timeline today. The meeting is now yours. It is yours. Yep.
Yes, I'll start.
Can we switch on the microphone?
Is it
it's
on? There we
good.
go. Okay. I'll start off. I'm Stacey Walsh. I'm from Interconnect Communications. And I've been doing a lot of work on the IoT lately. And I think my biggest cybersecurity concern or internet concern is IoT and how we build that in when we're connecting 1 million devices, and the fact that until very recently, a wearable, and well, some wearables still, was transmitting unencrypted data. And from that data, you could get the Wi-Fi password to whatever Wi-Fi you were on. And then from there, you can get into your house, your car, anything like that. But then also the cost that is incurred on companies putting in, maybe a good way to say is proportionate security into their devices, so that if you're building a smart light bulb, you don't increase the cost of that light bulb 3-fold. So what type of security should something have, and how will that fit into the broader security ecosystem?
Thank you very much, Stacey. I also think that this question, I saw Ian Brown nodding, and I know that there are at least 2 people in the room who had a very vivid discussion on IoT during day 0. So yeah, this question will go to the panel, and maybe it's something also to make note about to discuss on the second session, because we will have follow-up. Who was the second?
Hi, my name is Ansgar Kuhne from University of Nottingham, and sort of just raising an issue of our experience. Recently, we were contacted by the National Crime Agency in the UK and somewhat surprisingly, they seem to feel that people, especially young people, might not really care much about privacy that much, and that was a bit of a surprise to us.
Actually, this fits also
I'm going to ask you a clarifying question. Do you know the motivation for that statement?
Basically, they were contacting us to. They're busy with a scoping exercise to understand how they can go about surveillance in the coming years. How far can they push it before people will say this is not policing by consent anymore?
I took a note of Marco, and then I will come to you. And anyone having? Thank you.
Okay.
I took a note.
Mark Hoogman, NCC. I'll probably come back to that IoT thing because that is concerning. What's more in general concerning, and also in relation to that, is the cybersecurity. We put so much trust in technology and tend to forget that technology is built by humans. And at some point we sort of start this arms race towards better security where other technology is trying to defend ourselves. Isn't this turning into a human problem rather than a technological one?
Thank you very much, Marco.
Thank you. I'm Xander Baumann with Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Some US politicians seem to believe that building a wall makes you safer in your country. I'm not sure if that is the case, but it certainly doesn't help with a digital wall around your country. I'm interested in hearing the panel's views on international cooperation, and especially how to work on cybersecurity in developing countries.
We have a perfect person for this on the panel, Lea Kaspar, who is leading many cybersecurity capacity building efforts in developing countries. I don't know whether I'm better to come to this side first and then come back to you. I saw some hands raised here.
I see a lot of hands, but I'm going to ask for a little bit of focus. There are a lot of questions about future, but very little examples of what we're doing now and what are the practices from which we can learn. So if people can weave that into their thinking at this moment, we learn something about the current practices.
Taking this into account.
Hi, Corinne Cat from Article 19. So a current practice that we've been running into a lot, especially with our local offices, is that they are confronted with cybersecurity legislation that is really more or less a cover-up to sort of limit freedom of expression, especially of activists. And this is something where we are very concerned about, and also we're trying to figure out how can you best enable local people and enable local activists to stand up against this, because it requires not only a lot of knowledge about legislative processes, but also about the hard technical cybersecurity to be able to see, oh, this is a legitimate cybersecurity threat, and this is a cover-up for trying to do something else by a certain government.
Thank you very much. And now it will go around.
My name is Walter Natris. I'm one of the other people who was in the IoT session on day 0. A few things. The first one is the presentation of Google going forwards to 2026 yesterday, saying this world is completely safe, the IoT thing. If you look at today, it definitely is not. So, in other words, there are either ideas floating around or they're trying to pass a message which is not correct. And then we would like to know what those ideas are, because that would be best practice of the near future. Another thing how companies go about is the Windows 10 update, for example, on my laptop. So far I could ignore it because I didn't want it. I could buy with the new one. All of a sudden that changed and it started updating by itself because I pushed it away. All sort of security on my computer vanished. And I haven't been able to restore it yet. So all sort of updates on there don't work anymore. The AV doesn't work anymore. So what's the thought about best practices in cybersecurity from that angle? Another thing, and I'm going to plug NLIGF's workshop proposal for the coming IGF, is looking for best practices in cooperation. So there are several public-private initiatives that are working together and succeeding. And what are their best practices? And that is something I would like to try and find out, having the chance to do so in Guadalajara, because then you would actually be able to present them to other initiatives starting saying, ignore this because it's proven in the world that it doesn't work. And we're trying to get as much organizations to get together. For example, the Dutch Abuse Hub doing anti-malware work. That is apparently succeeding because the numbers seem to be going down. Why doesn't the European version, why isn't it active at this point in time, despite the 16 million euros that they had to deploy it? Why does the G7 network between the enforcement agencies work?
So why do certain collaborations work and why do some collaborations
falter?
I also understood like
that
why
are best practices that we need to find out about. So, and then you have some best practice on cybersecurity as well.
As far as I understand, it's also why certain collaboration work on the national level but cannot be leveraged on the international level. I saw, first here and then I will come to you.
Okay, I'm Tapani Tarvainen from Electronic Frontier Finland. But I'd like to make first a general observation that security is different for different actors, sometimes even contradictory requirements. Obvious cases being that the company and its clients may have different requirements and needs. Thinking of system administrator viewpoint, how much data I collect and keep of the people using it, log data, because it's useful for tracking down infringements, but also dangerous in case it leaks, and it may be against the interest of people using it that somebody can get at. So always keep in mind, security is not just the same for everybody. In the same transaction, same operation, different actors have different and even conflicting security needs.
Thank you.
I'm Colin Curry from Internet and Jurisdiction, and as the name implies, my question is about jurisdiction on the internet. To root my question in something in current practices, I know that there's been a lot of debate recently about modifying the protocol and the standards for cross-border access to user data. So I wanted to address the specific practices of law enforcement agencies and other cybersecurity related parts of government and how that relates to the cross-border internet. Basically how to reconcile territoriality in practice with the cross-border internet.
Okay.
Just quickly, one word I didn't know. So my name is Marit Palavert, I'm from the Internet Society. And one word I didn't hear yet is encryption. And as a kind of user, I wanted to understand, it's a buzzword in the community, all should be encrypted, some say not. But as a user, I think there's still a lot of unclear things as to when is my communication, automatically encrypted, when do I have to switch something on, which layers are protected, is this a kind of cover-all solution, or what are the complementary things that we should be thinking about?
Thank you very much. While I'm roaming here, raise your hands and I will see who is.
Thank you. I'm Dennis Broeders from Erasmus University in Rotterdam and Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. Like a looming question is the Internet of Things. Another looming question, I think, is, it's much talked about at the IEF, is sort of the next billion users. What does the next billion users, the fact that those next billion users are usually coming online in the global south on very cheap devices with little room to pay for connectivity, let alone for security, big numbers, lots of mobile. What impact does the panel think that will have on global internet security?
Sorry? Was trying to accommodate people, newcomers to this room. Anyone with a question on this side? Then the microphone is going to Marco.
Sorry again, but good point, Olaf. What do I do today to enhance security? And I think the high-level objective is promote openness and transparency, not only in the governance level, but also at the technical level, because I do think security improves by being open and transparent on what you're doing.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any more hands right now. Olaf, shall we move to the panel? Or shall we wrap up a bit? Because there were so many questions, there are so many issues raised on different level of security, on technical level of security, on users level of security, on encryption, on collaboration, on jurisdictions. Yes.
Yeah, that was one.
So,
did somebody capture them from the tweet?
I saw the Internet of Things questions on cybersecurity, trust in technology. Well, basically, most of all, when I was following the Twitter wall, it was rather reflecting questions that were already asked. So I think we are capturing everything so far.
Okay, that sounds like a plan. I've made some notes, but I saw the participants writing away frantically too, at least some of them. So let's start with some of these reflections. Maybe start from that last observation. As a general rule of thumb, is openness and transparency one of the basic features that we need in order to get to security? Panelists, please respond. Ian.
Absolutely. And I think a great benefit of a forum like this is you can have very detailed technical discussions, and you can go from the very technical end right up to the sort of legal and philosophical end. So I would say at both ends, absolutely. From the technical end, and my PhD 20 years ago was in computer security, the techies amongst you might know what's called Kirchhoff's principle, which is that the security of a system should not depend on the secrecy of the system, except for very, very small parts of it, like decryption keys. Everything else, in general, you get much more benefit. It's the philosophy of the IETF and of other open standards bodies. You publish everything for review, because the more people get the chance to review, and even ideally, these days in the IETF, we were just talking over the break, actually run automated security checks on new protocols to look for holes, which has proven quite successful. Some of the key IETF internet standards, people have found holes in using these sort of mathematical proof systems. So absolutely from that end, and I think it's important in the internet standards that we're all using. It's even more important, I think, from a public policy perspective in government security systems, where some elements of, for example, to take an extreme example, security services, intelligence agencies, where their default position is to keep a lot of what they're doing secret. I think that causes all sorts of problems. Kathy Brown, I think, very rightly said yesterday morning, even the governments, not to name any, that are heavy promoters of the multi-stakeholder model in internet governance, rush to closed security forums to make security decisions. And I think that's the wrong way round. I think the security decisions are the ones that have the even bigger impact on society and on people's rights. And it would be wonderful if, going forward, we can find a way to bring those security debates much more into this multi-stakeholder world.
Sorry, Ian, I have a question to you. If we are talking about best practices, do you already know an example of multi-stakeholder cybersecurity best practice which can be leveraged concerning what you're talking about, or any of the panelists?
Sure. Okay, again, a technical and a more governmental example. So the IETF itself, the Security Area Directorate, all of the work the IETF does on, not just on security-specific protocols like TLS, but actually every IETF standard has to have a security considerations section. Karine has done interesting work on whether that should be expanded to include privacy and human rights. I think that would be a great thing as well. On the public policy and governmental level, sorry for the blatant plug here, but we have a centre at Oxford which is trying to do precisely this, a Global Centre for Cybersecurity Capacity. I always get the acronym wrong because it's so long. My colleague over there can correct me. where we're trying to do exactly that, and we are not just doing this in the UK or in Europe, we are actively setting up regional hubs around the world. We have our first one just opening in Australia, in Melbourne, but we're also looking to do that in Southeast Asia, and then over time, and this is with partners in those regions, not just, Oxford University arriving and telling everyone what to do, which would be a huge mistake. We're also looking to do that in the Americas and in Africa. So I think mechanisms like that, we are hoping, I think, to participate fully in the IGF in Guadalajara. So I think, it would be great if we can use these discussions to more concretely institutionalize future multi-stakeholder dialogue.
Leah.
Yeah.
There is also a microphone you could hand over.
So, not that I disagree with what Ian was saying, and I don't think it's objection. I mean, I'm not objecting to the fact that we need more openness and transparency. Coming from a human rights, civil society angle, I would never argue that. I think that if we start from that as a basic point, we need to push the question a little bit further. I think I've been in the last couple of years, I've been hearing this argument over and over again. What we haven't actually cracked is how to convince people that that's actually useful and that that's actually leads to better solutions and better outcomes. One example where I think this was pretty evident is during the global conference on cyberspace that the Dutch organized last year. It was very interesting because, we were participating in an initiative to bring civil society and kind of open up the discussions at the conference. And in the end, there were, I don't know, over 300 non-governmental participants on the civil society side, or with private sector it must have been even more. But what happened is, what we saw is that a lot of the discussions moved into bilateral rooms. Right. So you had really anodyne discussions in the plenary that, they were not non-controversial, but the real discussions then moved into more closed forums. And I was talking to someone yesterday about how a lot of these discussions are now moving into, the G20 or forums that a lot of us don't have any access to. Perhaps to answer your question about examples of best practice in this, we've been working global partners on building a multi-stakeholder framework for engaging in cyber policies at the national level, and we published that last week. And I think what we're going to try and do is work with partners in different countries and try and pilot that. However, there isn't yet a model that people say that is working. I know that in Poland, some of the stakeholders I know that have tried setting that up in a similar model that internet governance multi-stakeholder discussions have been pushed through a number of IG initiatives. And just one last point there, at the UK level, we do have a multi-stakeholder advisory group on internet governance that I'm a part of, and I think that's best practice example on that side. However, when it comes to cybersecurity, and when we made the case that, can't those discussions and inter-ministerial discussions be opened up to other stakeholders when it comes to cyber, there was a much greater pushback. So I'd be interested in kind of discussing how we can make that how we can move from this principled approach to, yes, we need more openness and transparency, to, okay, how do we actually get there?
So does that, perhaps that is something that we can come back to, but doesn't that greatly depend on what type of discussion we're having? Cybersecurity is a broad field, so to speak. So perhaps we can reflect on that a little bit. On this topic, any of the other panelists? Nigel?
Yes.
Shall I speak in this? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, if I may, I'll put my glasses on because I can't even read the screen. I think this gets to the heart of the debate. So I think when the questions started to come in, again on this issue of cybersecurity, we have this very wide canvas. And this wide canvas is advantageous in that we are looking at all the different elements of what we call cybersecurity or internet security, and there's lots of different ways of describing it. But at the same time, it does cause a certain amount of confusion. Are we talking about technical security? Are we talking about surveillance? Are we talking about rights online? There's a whole canvas here. But I think what the question posed to us here gets to the heart of the matter, in that what we are seeing, from what I am seeing after sort of 25, 30, 35 years dealing with these issues, is that we're almost going back in time. So back in the 90s, governments discussed internet security. We didn't call it internet security then, we called it information security or whatever. And we discussed it amongst governments. Just occasionally, we'd allow the odd academic into the room. Civil society, you know, come on, don't be silly. Business, well, you know, you allowed some businesses in as long as they paid the government. You know,
why does this sound so good with a British accent?
so you know, we had a very closed environment, and then it started opening up, and it started opening up really because of the, if you like, the academic input, the civil society input, the growing awareness that these were problems that everyone ought to have a locus on. And there's been such excellent multi-stakeholder open work that the IETF and other organizations have done, and what Ian is doing in Oxford, etc. And there's great examples. But at the same time, we have this dichotomy where on the one hand we have these open discussions in the Internet Society, in the technical forums, in ICANN, in IGF, these great multi-stakeholder dialogues. And then at the UN, I mean, for me, I ought to be able to get into the UN, well, actually not. But so I tried to get in. I tried to get into a meeting on cybersecurity at the UN, and they said, "Oh, who are you?" First, I said, "I'm Nigel Hickson, and I can," which cuts no ice at all. And then I said, "Well, I'm the British government, actually," and they said, "You're lying, go home." But and this was a discussion. This was a preparatory discussion for the government group of experts. The government group of experts, they're not a secret, tryst or anything. They're a group of government officials of various countries, and the number of countries vary. Starting this summer, it's going to be 25 countries, meeting for perhaps a year at the United Nations and discussing cybersecurity at a very high level. There is no input to this process. It is not transparent. So how, as we as citizens and users, can really trust what governments are doing is an issue. And therefore, I think this whole issue of transparency and openness is crucial to this debate.
I'm first going to let it to the panel. The 10 minutes is after the I might break that rule at some point, but Alexandru, go ahead.
Thank you. So cybersecurity is also related with rule of law. The internet and its capabilities of forging new communities, boosting democracy or driving economic growth is also open for abuse. So it's used for connecting terrorists or pedophiles, facilitate crime, or enabling mass incursions of privacy. So in order to preserve the best of the internet, we need to tackle the worst of it. So governments need to protect their citizens against crime and also protecting human rights and liberties.
So the question rises, given that a lot of the internet is managed and operated by the private sector, doesn't that private sector have a role in helping governments with weeding out the worst? And when having that discussion around weeding out the worst, which by the way, weeding out the worst of the internet to keep that internet open is, I think, the appropriate approach. But isn't that, in essence, a multi-stakeholder discussion? Because some of the measures imposed by governments might break the fundamental nature of the qualities of the internet, so to speak. And then that hooks into a remark that was made earlier. Governments typically operate on national territories or regional coalitions, so to speak. How does that faction in with the global nature of the internet? So I think that's a bridge to what was mentioned earlier as a question. Ian. And Alexandra, I'll return to you.
Thanks, because that's a great link to my second plug, which is for my book, which you can have for free. I've bought free copies. Well, it's all free, and it's available online free, but if you want a copy, this is an example, I think, where we tried to do precisely what was just described. This is from an EU-funded research project called VoxPol, which is about violent online political extremism. This report is assessing the ethics and politics of policing the internet for extremist material. Indeed, we did exactly what you just described. We had a workshop here in Brussels where we had people from European intelligence agencies, police forces, the Council of Europe, the European Commission, national governments, civil society, industry, and we spent 2 days trying to thrash out some of the very difficult issues raised, as Alex said, by the way that terrorist groups are using the internet. And as you all know, certainly in Europe, and I imagine many other regions of the world, it's a red-hot political topic because of foreign fighters going to Syria and elsewhere, then coming back to their homelands and killing people. I also did follow-up interviews with a range of those varied stakeholders, and I hope, I mean, I'm not saying that this is the perfect answer to those difficult questions, but by getting all those perspectives, both separately and together, that you can start to answer some of them in a way that doesn't make everyone completely happy, because, of course, there isn't a perfect solution, but a way that both keeps most stakeholders feeling they've been listened to and that the solutions being proposed are relatively workable, which is another important fact of the multi-stakeholder model. You know, rather than recommending something that later a stakeholder, whether it's industry or others, tell you this will just never work, you can try to run through all those bugs before you make recommendations. But it also lets me make the broader point that I think a critical best practice for cybersecurity, well, two critical best practices for cybersecurity, which in one sense are old best practices. One of them is newer, which is the multi-stakeholder model, but one of them is much, much older than that, and Alex mentioned it already. It is the rule of law. The rule of law is a pretty basic best practice across all areas of government and democracy, and the rule of law is that laws are made democratically by legislators who have a mandate from voters. They're discussed openly in parliaments and the media, debated with civil society and with industry and other stakeholders, and then they're applied impartially and accountably by the courts and by law enforcement. And we do, as if you've heard Joe McNamee speak several times over the last couple of days, I think it's a very negative trend that we see in cybersecurity, a lot of measures that do not follow that model, actually, that are agreed behind closed doors between...
Do you have a recent example of that?
Well, the EU's new code of conduct, for example, which civil society groups tell me, I'm not saying this is the gospel truth, but then the Commission vigorously disagrees, but tell me was not agreed in a transparent, inclusive, multi-stakeholder way, and civil society groups led by EDRI have therefore been very critical of it. And I think if we can, we should try to avoid that in future for a number of obvious reasons. One, it's contrary to the rule of law, and therefore, unsurprisingly, when these kind of measures, it takes a long time, but get considered by the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights, as we saw with the Data Retention Directive, are struck down with a vengeance. I don't think that helps anybody. It doesn't help the security interests, let alone the freedom of expression and other civil society interests. But I think on the practical level, we're likely to get much more effective cybersecurity mechanisms where they're agreed between all stakeholders.
And the book is still available.
Please.
And then we return to...
And then we turn to Alexander.
I'm sorry. I think people in this room, many people have different ideas of what cybersecurity is. And one essential aspect of cybersecurity is protecting yourself once you've been attacked and making sure that you stay protected. And I think a very good example of good practice, which is done internationally with different associations of manufacturers, and it's done in the UK with most areas of industry, is that groups like pharmaceutical companies immediately tell all the other pharmaceutical companies what attack they have had, how it was done, and they find out from the specialist how to protect yourself from it. Now, I think this is very important good practice, because while we would all like to prevent, the important thing is to minimize the harm that is done to everyone. And so I really think that is a good practice that every country should have, and it's certainly done in the UK, and it's done internationally within certain groups of industries.
So you're basically talking about sectoral. So you're basically talking about sectoral information sharing or cross-sectoral information sharing, because it corresponds very well with what have been said. Something that works in one sector or in one country. The question is, why can't we sometimes leverage it to other sectors, other countries?
It started in the defence and aerospace sector many years ago. And it spread into new sectors doing exactly the same thing. Now, certainly in the UK, as part of our cybersecurity policy, all sectors get the information. So they're told very quickly about a new attack, and some of those attacks are specific to certain sectors, and others are much more widespread. And they're also told how to defend themselves from it. And I think that is a very important thing.
Before we go into this information sharing in sectors which I think relate a lot about trust networks.
In the second session, maybe.
Building trust networks. I want to return to Alexandru, because I think before we hop over to that topic of trust networks, let's close the intergovernmental piece.
So in relation with good practices, I may exemplify a practice. I know it is good because it is ongoing. So it's the work of the Cloud Evidence Group of the Council of Europe, who is a group established by the Cybercrime Convention Committee, TCY.
What is the name of the group?
Cloud Evidence Group. So there is
Cloud Evidence.
Cloud Evidence Group. So with the Budapest Convention, the Cybercrime Convention Committee is the one that the Committee of the Council of Europe that assess the implementation of the Budapest Convention in domestic legislation, and also find solutions to the new challenges identified in this area. And the Cloud Evidence Group is a group established by the TCY in order to identify solutions to the new challenges of the criminal justice access to transborder electronic evidence, which is an issue of importance for all criminal justice authorities. And the Cloud Evidence Group had a collaborative multi-stakeholder approach as it tried to obtain the views of all important stakeholders. So it held exchange of views, hearing, meetings with data protection organization in order to identify if this new proposed solutions will be in line with data protection requirements. Had 2 meetings in December 2015 and in April this year with internet service providers in order to obtain their view on this issue. And also held a meeting at Max Planck Institute in Freiburg in February.
I can confirm.
So in the first part of 2015, the Cloud Evidence Group identified which are the challenges for this criminal justice access to electronic evidence. And this year in February, it issued a informal summary, which is online on the website of the Council of Europe, where different solutions are proposed to address these challenges. And this solution goes from practical measure in order to make MLA process more efficient.
For MLA, sorry,
mutual legal assistance.
Okay, yep.
Process more efficient. It goes for a better cooperation, transborder cooperation between criminal justice authorities and internet service providers. And it can go to an additional protocol to the Budapest Convention to address these all new challenges.
Sure.
So,
sorry, a question from me. And there were some questions asked about human rights. So are human rights taken into account in these trans-border data flows? Because the question of safeguards is very important.
Yeah, the thing of developing new solutions to address these challenges under the umbrella of the Council of Europe, who stands for human rights, rule of law, and democracy, I think it's the best safeguard you can have. You also, the Budapest Convention, in its Article 15, clearly states that human rights and liberty should be protected and be embedded in all these new solutions.
I see you brought the convention.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm always carrying you with me.
And
it was very helpful when I was a police officer and the prosecutor.
Do you also hand?
Very
I
helpful.
know. I was sort of hoping you would hand those out free as well.
I came by plane.
You wanted to respond very shortly.
brief,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then after that, I want to ask Bastiaan what he has heard so far. So we sort of talking about the transborder and issues and government approaches.
Yeah, just to say, I think it's great for the reasons Alex just said. The Council of Europe is getting more involved in this debate, and as others have said this morning, I've seen, we can either wait for states to come to us, or we can also go to the forums where the states are talking to each other and not so carefully listening. So I would really encourage people, join these groups, where they are open to what broader participation, online and in person.
Can we give microphone to Leah as well? Maybe you want to address this.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's
of
absolutely
course, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm just like listening to this and going to IGFs and EuroDIGs and conversations like that. What strikes me is that we all kind of be singing in agreement, right? So it's almost like preaching to the choir, right? And it's concerning. So last week I was in, and I'll tell you why I think it's concerning. I mean, it's great that we have agreement here. So last week I was in a meeting of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and that was founded after the GCCS conference in The Hague. And all that I heard was talking about threats, right? So there are increasing threats. How do we deal with attacks? How do we deal with this? And I don't know if anyone mentioned human rights, if anyone mentioned openness and transparency. There was very little conversation about this. So if I just may, I think we can keep talking about this, but the problem statement that I would like to kind of nail here and clarify is that we need a paradigm shift in how cybersecurity is being approached and how we talk about these things. At the moment, it's still very binary, and I know that a number of conversations in EuroDIG have been about this. So how do we avoid the binary framing between human rights and security? How do we ensure and promote policies where both sides see that security and human rights are reinforcing, right? That you need security in order to enjoy your human rights and vice versa. So it's, that's the, and there was a conversation about economy and human rights as well, right?
It struck me that this dichotomy is even in the title of the plenary session. I got used to cybersecurity versus human rights, but seeing economy versus human rights struck me because about paradigm shift, sorry for the comment from moderatorial, I really think that if we are at EuroDIG, at multi-stakeholder forums, put these in the titles, we are already sending the wrong message, and then I'm wondering how much time it will require to actually shift this paradigm. How? Olaf, with your authority, where should I go? Panel?
Well, I sort of want to listen to our rapporteur just to create a little bit of rest and see where we are, what he has taken away, and then we continue where we were.
Yes. Bastiaan?
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. What have I taken away? Well, let me start off by paraphrasing Nigel. It has been a very wide canvas, and from that perspective, it's been very interesting. When we started giving the floor to the audience, and we went from the Internet of Things and how far do you want to go when investing costs, right? When securing devices, is it actually a human challenge or a technical focus that we need here? We touched upon international cooperation and like what does this mean for developing countries. Article 19 even mentioned like cybersecurity being used as part of a different agenda to actually cover up other things and harm freedom of expression, for instance. The responsibility of software vendors, Windows 10 was mentioned. But I have here 5 points that I actually find most important. First of all, the technical versus human component that Marco started off with. Ian referred to the fact, from a technical perspective, we do not want to see security by obscurity. Refer to the open standards and like how we work within the ITF. From a human perspective, the focus has been on cooperation and expectations. But also that security means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, different interpretations, and how does that work cross-border? And this, of course, brings significant challenges for governments within, who work within their national jurisdictions. The importance of openness and transparency, wonderful, very nice principle. But how do we put that into actual practice? I like the example of what happened at the Global Conference of Cyberspace. Like all the nice words used in the plenary, but actually all where the business was done was bilaterally, and that were actually closed sessions.
And it's Dutch, isn't it, there?
Yeah, so that is very recognizable. Are we going back in time, like where it started off, amongst governments, and then opening up the multi-stakeholder process, and now, as governments have more of an eye on what's actually happening in cyberspace, part of the agenda seems to go back, and it's being determined amongst governments. I like the 2 critical best practices that Ian referred to, so both the multi-stakeholder model and the rule of law, which seem actually very clear to me, and that's a nice starting point. And last but not least, Tatjana, I think, referred to it, are human rights sufficiently taken into account when discussing different approaches?
There were several people referring to it. Yeah. I believe we started with Corinne from Article 19, and Leah, and me, and Ian.
Fotjon, any responses from cyberspace? No?
There is an intervention from the audience, and then I will go back to Nigel, because he wanted to intervene.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to Leah on the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise. I think you have to understand where it comes from. The global GCCS was organized by 3 Dutch ministries: foreign affairs, so human rights, security and justice, so everything to do with threats and all the other things, and a little bit by economic affairs, about the economy of the internet. The GFCE is run from the National Cyber Security Center of the Netherlands. That's where the secretariat more or less is positioned. So if you want a real debate with those people, have them on your panel. And on the other hand is that they also do things like responsible disclosure. So, so there are definitely topics which are different from threats. And it's open for everybody to come up with topics. So in other words, if you manage to strike a coalition...
But the last bit is incorrect. It's not open to everyone to open topics. I'm actually on the advisory board of the GFC, and while I really am amused by mansplaining, I mean, it's incorrect what you're saying. And if you want to bring an initiative to the GFC, you have to be a member. Membership to the GFC was closed to governments and private sector, and the advisory board was set up as part of the Dutch government initiative to open it up. And I think that's great, but we have a long way to go before it's open and before people can actually suggest what should be done there.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm wondering why the transcript is covering Leah Kasparis, Tatiana Tropina. If it can be changed, it would be good, I believe. Because when Leah started talking, there was Tatiana Tropina. I don't know, is that confusion in our voices or confusion in something else?
The main message remains, make sure that the right people are in your panels, because that's the only way to open up a discussion. And I don't really see them sitting in the panel. And that changes things because you start talking to each other.
Marilia, I saw your hand. I will come to Nigel and then I will come back to you. Or would you like to...
Yeah, let's stick to the audience for a while.
Yes.
See where it goes.
Thank you, Tatiana. This is Marilia speaking. I am from Brazil. Actually, I just would like to voice Leah's concerns about openness and participation. I know that Leah and others in civil society have done a great job in opening up the cybersecurity conference. I think that the Dutch government has been very prone to opening discussions as well, but this is not the only space where cybersecurity discussions are taking place. I mean, we have an upcoming GGE discussion starting, the governmental experts in the UN First Committee. There are some experts, academics that have very much a contact and a frame of thinking that come from the military sector that are trying to move forward discussions on legal basis, how to implement the Tallinn Manual that has a very much a traditional understanding of how sovereignty should apply to cyberspace. We had a meeting in the beginning of this year. Olaf was there too. For us, coming from a multi-stakeholder environment, it's astonishing how governments still see sovereignty as something that applies without being transformed into something else on cyberspace. So I think that these are spaces, and I completely agree with Leah, in which we do not have opportunities enough to participate, and we are not really aware that this discussion is taking place, and this needs to change, because we did not have yet any major disruption or a cyber conflict of big proportions on cyberspace. But when we do, and this moment probably will come in the future, these are the people that governments will resort to, that everyone will want to listen in the future. It's not the most stakeholder community, but people that are advancing this discussion, from a military standpoint. So I think it's really important for us to breach these silos, and if they don't come to us, then we should go to them somehow.
So I think this is a good bridge into something that I've heard before, so to speak. That I call it subsidiarity to some extent, both on geographical as well as in topical areas. People tend to cluster together and collaborate with trusted communities. That's sort of my observation. Good examples of that are CSearch. The pharmaceutical example that was just given is a very nice example where I would say both on a geographical scale, like within the UK, but also on a topical clustering, namely pharmaceuticals, people got together and said, we need to fix something here. Let's get it done. We know our space. We have trusted relationships. Let's get this done. My thesis listening to this is that in other environments, namely military environments where cyber war and cyber threats and cyber defense are discussed, the trust relations with the other sectors have not yet been built. So that's sort of the thesis that I want to throw at the audience. How is it that sometimes these trust relations work, and why is it that sometimes they don't? I think that question was asked earlier, but to me it feels like that is sort of an undercurrent of the discussion that I heard so far. Is this related to trust between communities? Question mark.
We threw this question to the audience, so Nigel, I'm sorry, I will come back later to you with a microphone.
Hi, my name is Kostas Moulinos from the European Network Information Security Agency. On that particular area, we have already made and produced reports how you build trust communities, first. And second, we maintain a lot of different groups from different sectors, both governmental or industry and so on. What I would like, as a general rule of thumb, I would say that there is a tendency to particular cultures. It's a matter also of nationalities, I would say. And in general, the countries south trust less the governments when compared to the countries in the north. The most successful information...
Question, is that a European division or a global division?
I'm talking about European, okay, because all the studies we do is for Europe. only for Europe, are for Europe. This is a general rule of thumb, and the best, so to say, good initiatives for sharing we can find in the northern countries, especially in the Scandinavian countries. This means something. This means that people there, they trust each other more, and they have established communication channels with a long history back. This is one of the
so
key
cultural aspect, a true cultural aspect.
And one remark I would like to say is that at ENISA we never use the term best practices. It's wrong, because the better is always an indefinite loop. So all the time you can find better and better practice. So we use the term good practices. Okay.
That's a very good point. We put the title of the session with a question mark. Are they
Well,
really
and the word best current practices. We actually talk about current. Anyway, Dennis.
I wanted to react to your point about the sort of the division between the two groups and how to build bridges. I think there is another cultural aspect there, and it is that it is national security services, is military organizations that are now turning towards the internet, who have a very specific, esprit de corps, who have a very specific notion of what their role is, which is very much nationally orientated, thinking in terms of national survival, have a long tradition of thinking in this way and now transplanting it to the internet, which is wholly different from the way the internet community, especially the technical community, has always seen and construed the internet as a global asset, as something that is collaborative, that is open. These two things clash. Marilia and I were at the same meeting in Geneva, which was actually in the run-up to the next GGE, so it's not like there's no contact at all, but it's very limited. And one of the takeaways I had there was that these communities look at each other, so the diplomatic communities and the people in this case from the technical community looking at each other and sort of baffled by the fact that when they talk about security, they mean something totally different. Completely different. But as one small slimmer of light that came from that, there was sort of a tendency, okay, we need to do this more often because we do mean something completely different. We're in this boat, at least to a certain extent, to the same for the ride, and we need to know more about each other's definitions and what we actually mean. Also, from a realization, I think, with some of them at least, that when it comes to actual cybersecurity, to actual sort of keep up the network, it's not the military that's going to do it. It's going to be technical communities, it's going to be companies, it's going to be all the partners within the global infrastructure that are going to be responsible for doing that. So they need to turn to somewhere also when push comes to shove. So, but I think there's a massive gap, and it has to do with a long tradition. I mean, military tradition is a lot longer than the internet. So, give them time.
And the rule of law.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience, please?
Hi, George Christou, University of Warwick in the UK. I just want to maybe expand that discussion further in terms of culture. You talk about between countries, but much of the interaction, I guess, between the technical, the police, judiciary is cross-jurisdictional as well. So I wonder if there's any further information or studies or research on actually, because I know ENISA did those reports quite a long time ago, on how they actually cooperate and what works for them. There was some good work on secondments, for instance, so that people start to learn how different cultures work and they gradually begin to work together in a better way. But I just want to throw out and wonder if there's anything else out there that we could talk about in terms of good practice.
Walter Natris. I've been involved in several initiatives in the past 10, 12 years on cross-border and national, let's say cross-border between very different institutions. And where everything starts with is bringing the right people together. And just like Dennis is saying, that as soon as people have met 3 times, things tend to change because all of a sudden they start to understand their own background better, but also the background of the other organization. And that's the starting point of building trust. And yes, there has been several successful initiatives. I remember being involved in the ENISA CSIRT and enforcement agencies meetings where I was able to give a few presentations over the past years. And then I went away to my own consultancy, so I left the job I was in. And I heard last year someone from the CSIRT defend the cooperation with law enforcement. Well, in the meetings I was in, that was something which was totally unthinkable. They don't cooperate. They've come from a different planet. We're technicians and you're something else. I had that with the spam enforcement agencies across the world that meet once a year, but after 2 meetings it was possible to call someone from the Netherlands in Washington saying, I need your help because we found this IP address or this domain name or whatever. And where first cooperation was not possible, it now is. Nationally, I think Melanie, for example, in Switzerland is another example where people start working together who never worked together before on, for example, botnet mitigation. So perhaps, Adrian, you would like to say something about it, but there are things that work.
I'm going to take 5 more minutes for the audience. I see one more hand there, and a second hand there, and a third hand there. That's the end of the queue, those 3 hands. After that, we return to the panel. The panel has 10 minutes to respond, and then we need to wrap up. Things go fast when you're having fun.
I also saw that the panel feels impatient and a bit abandoned, but we will go to the audience first.
I'm sort of slowly silently sitting here in the corner listening. But what I miss a bit, and that a lot of this, and I know that kind of security in general is a bit reactive. We are looking at sharing best practices, but then it's mostly about sharing information about breaches, sharing practices on how to trace it. What I miss a bit in this discussion is there anything we can do proactively in sharing our best practices? How to defend ourselves?
I want you back in the next session, which is forward-looking. Thank you.
A question, or rather something that I've noticed in this discussion is that there's a lot of talk of public-private partnerships. And the problem of that, as Leah had already mentioned, if civil society perspectives aren't welcome or aren't allowed to be in the room, then we end up with code of conduct that don't necessarily align with the rule of law as we have it or with the perspective of civil society. And I think it's really important to point that out. I also think it's important to look at what the alternatives are where we can have such partnerships, but everybody is around the table and you really have multi-stakeholderism. And so David Kay, who published his latest report on Monday, he's the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, also specifically focuses on the responsibility of private actors in the digital age and says that if you want to be able to do something like this, you can't just have that be a conversation between governments and the private actors and keep everybody else who will be subject to these rules that come out of it out of the discussion.
Thank you, Corinne.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Sasha from University of Sarajevo. I wanted to reflect on a couple of things. One of them is cooperation amongst industries. This is a story from the trenches. Sometimes I work with a law enforcement agency as a court expert witness. We had a breakout of attacks on electronic banking in Bosnia. The same attack that was used someplace else, some other places. It seems that the banks have not exchanged any information whatsoever. And eventually people got hurt because companies were attacked, their bank accounts were emptied, basically for a lot of money, and banks were not really helpful at that stage. Another thing that came as a question that is raised here, cross-border evidence. Basically, most of the attacks happened using tools from various countries. First attack was based on Russian-developed software. Attacked on IT is the company. Part of the attack was realized through the TeamViewer, again, US-based company. Law enforcement agencies have rather good cooperation with the Interpol, Europol, to access data from other law enforcement agencies. But they don't have real influence or way to tell TeamViewer to give them data on a particular IP address, or ISP provider, there was one in Bulgaria, the other one is in Russia. So that kind of cross-border cooperation does not really work. Actually, it does work, but if it's after 2 months, it's worthless, basically.
not on internet scale and time. I'm looking at the clock. We have 2 more minutes, and I had seen a hand over there, so I'm extending the queue by available time.
Thank you, you're very generous. My name is Ludmila Georgieva. I'm from the Austrian Permanent Representation to the EU. So I have here the European Union focus. One issue, because was mentioned, good practice, best practice in Austria. We have set up a cybersecurity platform, which is a public-private partnership for business, academia, and administration within the Austrian cybersecurity strategy. This is one point where people can exchange and maybe develop trust, getting to get to know each other. Maybe just to throw some facts or some in the discussion, because it was mentioned the rule of law. We have now in the European Union, you have the Network Information Security Directive, which is, I think, the first ever legal measure which was now adopted, which will come into force in 2 years. And maybe also data protection, what was also mentioned, the human rights focus. You have data protection regulation, but you have also now, for the first time, a directive for data protection for law enforcement purposes. Let's say it like this. It's not the correct title, but it's a very long title. Just to throw it in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that is all very timely, because now we go back to our panel, and I've seen Nigel shifting in his chair for quite a while now. What is so interesting about the Twitter wall behind us is that we also see our panel participate through Twitter.
Yes, I saw some mischievous smiles on the panel. People were tweeting.
Truly interactive panel.
Yeah.
I mean, I had it started going. I was slightly frustrated because I wanted to intervene a bit earlier, because I thought we had a really, I'm not saying that the last thread wasn't interesting, but I thought the previous one, we were really getting to something very significant. And I think in this room, at this IGF, at this EuroDIG sort of meeting, we need to stay at this level. And I think Leia really put her hands on it with the explanation of the GFCE. And what we are seeing, I think, I mean, perhaps I was too jokey in my first intervention. We have a multitude of platforms. We have a multitude of initiatives. We have lots of areas where issues are being discussed on what we term cybersecurity, and I know there's different areas on that. But the question we come back to is, A, are those initiatives sufficiently transparent and open? Are they too narrowly focused? What real effect do they have? And how are we going to bring these different initiatives together? And my observation, having sort of worked on these issues in ICANN a bit, is that we are in a very difficult situation, in that we do have some excellent initiatives going forward. And what Ian is doing at Oxford, and I'm not just saying that because he's sitting next to me, but that is an initiative which I think has the potential, as Fadi Chahadi would say if he was in this room, our former CEO, of being, if you like, the focus, of being the way, of being the methodology of bringing some of these issues together. Because if we look outside of the other organizations working on this, the Dutch initiative we've heard is has some issues with it. We have the overall initiative of the cyberspace conferences, and will it be picked up again? And it's really morphed into something which it wasn't supposed to be when the UK set it out. We've got the Council of Europe doing some excellent work, but how does it bring in? We've got the ITU doing work in this area. And we might say, well, what's it got to do with the ITU? But the ITU spend a lot of money in this area on cybersecurity standards, some of which I'm told perhaps are good, some of which I'm told are not good. We've got the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization. We've got the Organization of American States. We've got the World Bank. We've got all these different initiatives spending money, doing capacity building. And what what is the end effect? And this is where I think we have, the worry. I'll stop there.
I think I hear you,
Good.
No. And I
It was very
agree,
hard not to hear
I
you.
agree with you. So this is where I'm reflecting back to, this is my teaching moment with respect to collaborative security, which indeed says, we have to work from a set of values. We have to be risk-based. If it comes to the internet, we don't want to flush the baby with the bathwater. We have to be the values as human rights, and so we have to take that into account. The thing that I'm not quite sure I agree with you is the bringing together part. And the reason is, if we look at, say, other initiatives coping with big societal global issues, it is not always the case that all these initiatives are necessarily aligned. People do a lot of things, and sometimes they are effective, and sometimes they're not. I do agree when we say we need to know of each other. I do agree when you say make sure that the people who do the work are in the room. I'm not quite sure if we need to get everything bolted together, but I'm also not sure if you said that. So
I didn't say everything. Nothing ever is going to be all bolted together. But I mean, climate change has managed this to an extent, and I think the real danger on the cybersecurity agenda is that it gets so fragmented. I'm talking about the internet being fragmented, but the debate on cybersecurity gets so fragmented that you lose the real nuggets of expertise which are out there.
I think you're right. The amount of clue in the universe is a constant, and that clue cannot be everywhere.
And following up, and I very much agree with Nigel on that. And I'm very disappointed to hear about the GFCE, because I had thought that was not making these same mistakes again. So I hope either that can be fixed in future, or it becomes a backwater, because clue and attention is limited. Those of us that spend much of our lives going to these meetings can just about keep up, but that's very few people in the world, and everyone else shouldn't have to rely on that small number of people doing that. A more academic perspective I would give to you all on that as well, which I think is particularly relevant for civil society, is if you read a book called Information Feudalism by Peter Drahos and John Braithwaite, which is an excellent account of how the trade-related it's such a mouthful. The WTO's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights came about, and the core message from that book, which is very relevant for cybersecurity, is big states, not just the US, but the US is one example, are very adept at forum shifting, as academics call it, of finding the forum that is most aligned to what they want to get, and then focusing all their attention there, and excluding other interests, whether that's civil society or certain parts of industry, that will get in the way. So this is another risk of the fragmentation that Nigel describes, that I don't know if there's anyone from the US government in the room, and I don't mean this as an attack on the US government, but fragmentation leads to the most powerful actors getting their own way, to the exclusion of almost everyone else in this room, I would say.
Cognizant of time, I want to give the panel the opportunity for final remarks.
Thank you.
And with the panel, I include you, Tatjana, for final remarks.
So 2 final remarks. The first one is in relation with the question made by the gentleman from Sarajevo. So this issue of cross-border investigation is an issue very important for criminal justice authorities who need data, who now is located in different jurisdictions. In 2015, more than 100,000 requests for data were transmitted directly to service provider, the 6 big service providers, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, Yahoo, and 2 other. And in 60% of the cases, this request for data were replied. So there is a concern on this type of data flow, and how can this be covered and embedded in human rights perspective and rule of law? And this is an issue the Cloud Evidence Group is trying to address. And the second remark I would have is that we need to have a clear line between national security measures and criminal justice investigations. we have to be very clear on what these two types of gathering electronic evidence concern.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nigel.
I don't think I've got any more to say. No, I won't say anything. But
In
I mean,
that case, thank you.
But I think this has been an excellent opportunity, and I'm glad that you have another panel that can carry forward some of these issues.
And I hope you will be there and contribute from the audience, Nigel. Thank you.
Sorry, before Ian wraps up, as a Twitter user, maybe you can wrap up in 140 symbols?
No, we're not there yet. No, we're not there yet. We still have
really?
6 minutes for this wrap-up.
Then
and
you
then
have 2 minutes.
I get
at
3
least.
tweets.
Yes.
I agree with everything that's just been said, and I encourage the Council of Europe, as they do, to make sure civil society is fully involved in those debates. Because you do sometimes see, even within the Council of Europe, slight polarization between the more law enforcement-focused parts of the Council of Europe and the more human rights-focused parts, and that civil society, in practice, I mean, this is something we didn't get to, but it's very important to civil society. You know, they have to be able to, in practice, contribute, not just in theory. And that sometimes might even need, as the Council of Europe does, to pay their travel expenses, or for the EU and for ICANN to continue their good work in fellowships and other mechanisms to actually pay for some of their time. Because, you know, I do, you know, it is part of my job to come to meetings like this. It's, you know, civil society activists, the money's got to come from somewhere. So I think that's really important. My second and closing, other practical, small but very significant issue builds on what Dennis said. One of the reasons it's so difficult for national security type discussions to be multi-stakeholder is that though the people in those communities are very used to excluding, I mean, even former senior civil servants like Nigel that don't have top secret security clearance. You know, they will leap to say, maybe you did, Nigel. No, you probably did, given what you used to do. But it's really, I don't know about the rest of the world, but actually in the UK, it's very difficult to get what's called DV clearance in the UK. I really would be surprised if someone like me would get it. I don't mean that I've done anything, you know, particularly outrageous in my youth, but it takes 6 months. It costs £30,000 plus. You have to have a sponsor. So that automatic, you know, the moment discussions go into those kind of fora, by definition, they cannot be multi-stakeholder. And unsurprisingly, some of the consequences are bad for the technology industry, the internet, civil society interests, academia, you know, everything else.
Leah.
So yeah, thanks. And the first point that Ian made gave me a segue into what I wanted to say, and it was to do with resources. And if you wanted to focus your attention on something that what we're discussing here, I'd say you can't cover it. Nigel's right, you can't cover everything. And I think that what you said was actually on point, because there's so many different, this is such and partly that's a problem, like the complexity of what covers, what cyber covers. IoT, surveillance, data protection, cybercrime, cyber warfare, right? There's all these levels. I mean, how do you even figure out where to go? So, I mean, if you have limited resources, what we've been trying to say is like, all right, let's focus at the principle level and try to promote the paradigm shift. I know Tatiana will be working on this as well, and think about how you define cybersecurity and how you frame the debate so that when it comes to all of these forums, they have a starting point that is already based upon a human rights respecting approach to cybersecurity. Thanks.
Do you have any comments?
I have only one comment. I think this discussion was an excellent bridge for our follow-up session, because we still have so many discussion points where we didn't even touch upon that much, like Internet of Things, and I believe that we gathered so much points to discuss in the follow-up session. I think it's excellent.
Good.
And remember your free book.
We're not done yet. The time management is going great.
You're not free yet. You can't run away.
We have 5 more minutes. Before I'm going to give the word to Bastiaan to summarize what we talked about, or try to summarize what we talked about, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes after the summary and think of an ideal world, and think of what, if you were the absolute ruler of the internet, which best practice would you impose on the internet as a whole or the society that deals with the internet. What best practice that makes the world more secure would you impose on the world? That's the question. The answer, you all get to answer that in a tweet. The panelists get to answer that in a tweet read out to you all. So that's the question. And now over to Bastiaan.
Bastiaan, I will give you the microphone only if you promise that it would be 4 points.
I can combine two. Thank you, Tatjana. I think we had a very interesting second part. I won't reiterate what I summarized after the first 45 minutes. Olaf started off the second part with mentioning that people tend to cluster together and collaborate within trusted communities. With a trusted relationship, something can be done. And how to build on this with other clusters and communities and potentially combine them. We need to collaborate to get things done. And then the essential point is to create trust between stakeholder groups. That remains a challenge. There were positive examples mentioned between CERTs working together with law enforcement, also in battling spam. Dennis then made also a very interesting comment with regard to diplomatic communities and technical communities trying to get together, but the gap remains huge. Positive, though, that the intention is to continue the dialogue. But how, if you have these clusters, it's interesting to see that there are a lot of initiatives ongoing, but how to keep them open. More transparency is necessary, especially when there are public-private partnerships and other stakeholders like civil society cannot participate. And last but maybe not least, we have a multitude of platforms initiatives. They're all spending a lot of money and doing capacity building. But how open and transparent are they? What effect do they actually have, and how to bring them together? And the latter part is an open question still. Maybe we can go into more detail this afternoon.
Yep. Thank you. So I want to get a... Oh, look at that ding. That is exactly on time.
Dear panelists, you're not going to...
No. But I want to do an experiment. Bastiaan just gave a summary. I want to get a sense of the room, whether that summary aligns with your thoughts, and I'm going to do that with the ITF hum. So I'm going to ask you a question, which is... I'm going to ask you a question whether Bastiaan's summary was a reasonable summary of the events. If you think that is the case, you hum, which is just go, Then I'm going to ask you whether it was not a reasonable summary. If you think that is the case, you hum. Based on the audio level, we get a sense of the room. This is a methodology that is used to get a sense in the room in the ITF, because a show of hands is like, a sort of binary, and here you get the feel of, a sort of unidentifying sense of the room. So, if you think that Bastiaan's summary was reasonable, then please hum now. I shouldn't hum because my microphone is on. If you think it was not a reasonable summary, please hum now. So, your tweet. What best practice would you impose on the world? Leah.
140 symbols, Leah.
Okay, I'm going to try and calculate this. It's a pessimistic one. I'd say start again, build an internet that has human rights baked into its infrastructure.
That's a very nice wish on the vision tree.
Make security considerations, human rights considerations in all RFCs, and rule of law.
Make a rule that we never talk about these issues without all stakeholders around the table.
Yeah. And balance security with confidentiality and other human rights on the internet.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
I hope to see you all back. I hope you all tweet your wish for now. After the break, we reconvene in this exact room, and then we're going to look forward. We're going to look towards trusting our cyber environment and what is needed to build that trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.